Hello, and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Doctors Schuster and Oxley, The Power of Stories. I was racking my brains, as I often do, trying to think about how to introduce this particular podcast. I try and make these interesting, pertinent to our conversation over the next 30 or 40 minutes. And the word that kept bouncing around my head was pragmatism. Now, perhaps that'll become apparent why that word was bouncing around after this introduction, and we share a discussion with Dr. Alison Edgar, who's joining us, MBE, I might add, who's joining us in this particular episode. But it's not a particularly glamorous word. It's often a word, pragmatism, being practical, using common sense. Often I think we overlook it in search of something more glamorous, shooting for the stars, moonshots. Often in business, we hear these grandiose terms. How are we going to change the world? And there's a place for those things. When we formed the Doctors and Schuster partnership, it was to try and provide career advice that was relevant to the people that we work with, relevant to the people we knew. And a lot of it we felt was sort of common sense, pragmatism, the idea that you deal with the facts as they exist, not as you want them to be. You put one foot in front of the other and you make something happen. But like all great journeys, now I'm getting into cliche zone here, it starts with just putting one foot in front of the other. One of the things we did when we were building the first book is you've got to write blurb for these books, and the thing that goes on the back, let's talk about who we are as authors. And we came up with this idea that we were optimistic realists. And I liked it. I don't know that Helmut did. He'll explain whether or not he liked it or not. But the idea was that we were optimistic. We wanted to create a better future. We felt that there was reason to believe that there was a better future to be created, that young entrepreneurs had the world. We certainly left them a lot of problems, but they had the skills to help overcome them. And we were optimistic they could do that. But we're also realists. We live in the world that we exist. We particularly understand that in the corporate world, the systems that are created around careers often have very odd outcomes, unintended consequences, we often call them. I just think they're absurd. They create absurd behaviors because they promote the idea that you get a bonus for doing something that doesn't necessarily make sense, or you get promoted for looking good rather than necessarily solving problems. So, we understand the world doesn't always function the way we would love it to. And that's why I think the idea of being a realist is important, but optimistic ones. Then we talked about, well, does that mean we're all about substance over form? And, I think the answer to that question is if we have to make a choice, then we are more about substance than form. But that doesn't mean that you can't appreciate beauty or perfection or excellence. I think where I think we came from is that excellence emerges, or perfection or something beautiful emerges from being pragmatic, from working hard. But more importantly, I kind of think that you might feel that you want to change the world, but how do you go about doing that? Well, you've got to be practical about it. You've got to put one foot in front of the other and do the fairly tedious task that might be required over the next 24 hours to give you the opportunity to change something meaningful. So I think we admire craftsmanship. I think that's one of the things that we said. We admire the idea that people have a desire to be idealistic, but then to reduce that to practical steps, to get on with it, to do something, to use common sense, to try and create short-term goals that really tread gently towards something quite extraordinary. Helmut loves me quoting Peter Drucker, personal hero of his. So Peter Drucker said, plans are only good intentions unless they immediately degenerate into hard work. So that's a very Austrian perspective for you. Let's wrap up this introduction a little bit. Final quote, Teddy Roosevelt, do what you can with what you have where you are. And this, I think, is the sort of pragmatism that I think I'm going to end with. Now, Helmut, I always throw it over to you to correct my homework here. So how do you respond to the intro?
Well, I think great intro, as always, very well researched, as you realize. Alison, David does a lot of prep work, and I find that very impressive. But I agree on one thing. It's so far more important to get things done, do things. And just a quick thing, when I went to Britain to work for BP for the very first time, and I used to spend high school in America, my boss at the time in Austria said, listen, you mustn't confuse, it's not America, yeah? Britain, the dinner speech is as important as getting things done. And I had no clue what he was talking about. However, so many years later, I realized it's substance and form, to basically go back to the quote of substance and form. So yes, I think getting things done, being pragmatic, I think is great. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And I know, Alison, that you're probably the most pragmatic, getting things done person on the planet. So it's a privilege having you here. And with that, I always ask a few questions. And as I know you quite well, to every question I'm going to ask you, I have the answer for myself. Yeah, how well to check how well I do know you actually. What is your favorite night out, or even better, what was your favorite night out in 2025?
Well, I don't even have to think about that one because there is one event that I always, every single year, go, that was my favourite night of the year. And Helmut, you happened to be there at my favourite night of the year in 2025, and that is the Attitude Magazine Awards. And the reason that I love it so much, again, I'm a big ally of the LGBTQAI plus community. And I just feel you go to an event like that, your people are there being 100% themselves. It's full of fun, energy, and just everything that I love to spend my time with. So yeah, you were actually at that night, Helmut.
Yes, I was there, and I kind of guessed that this would be your answer. Now, I'm less sure what your answer is. What is most recently the movie you liked the most? I know that you sometimes like to watch movies. So what is your favorite movie? Can be Netflix, whatever you really enjoyed and inspired you.
Oh, I love this movie because I love the book. I would say, as a dyslexic, reading is really difficult for me, and reading non-fiction is really hard, which is why I actually loved your book, because you managed to get a non-fiction book into fictional characters that to me made so much sense. I just so loved the book. But my favourite book is One Day. So it was written by David Nichols, and it sits around one day every single year and two different people and things that go on in their life at that time. And I can remember reading the book when I was in France years ago. And again, without no spoilers, but there's something that happens in the book that I just wasn't expecting. So my favourite film is based on my favourite book, and that is One Day by David Nichols is the book, which then became the film. And there's two versions. There's one which was a Netflix series, and then there was the original film. But I love it. I just I could watch it over and over again.
I didn't guess this answer, but I agree with you. I love the Netflix series as well. It's just great.
Yeah.
So the last question, and you can basically plea the Fifth Amendment if you want. What is your favorite startup?
Well, I think that we've both got a favourite startup, Helmut. So I think for me, I've got the trademark for the brand, The Entrepreneur's Godmother. So I spent a lot of time in the startup community, especially young startups. And I can remember now 12 years ago, I went to an event which was the shortlist of Entrepreneur of the Year awards. And I was a bit late, and I don't do late, but it was to do with travel arrangements. I was coming down from Glasgow and slightly late. As I walked in, I met a 15-year-old boy who had a startup. He was wearing what I would have deemed as like his dad's suit. Nothing seemed to fit him. The collar was too big on the shirt. And that startup is Ben Towers, now Ben Towers MBE. And I've gone through several, as you have in his company, several different versions of his businesses. He had one called Social Marley back in the day. He was going to take over instead of like a Hootsuite or Buffer. He's going to compete against that. It then went and he started to Hora, and now he is Happel. So hands down, I have a favourite young entrepreneur, and I have a favourite business, which is Happel.
Okay, I got that right as well. And I fully agree with you. The most amazing entrepreneur, and the MBE is well deserved, well earned. So with that, David, I segue over to you to introduce the
Thank
story
you.
part of the.
So, as you've already guessed, our guest today is Dr. Alison Edgar MBE, world famous for being the godmother's entrepreneur. also best-selling author of Smash It, The Art of Getting What You Want. I've also written a globally recognized coach for leaders and founders, if that's not obvious from being the godmother's entrepreneur. From humble beginnings, the backstory is extraordinary. It's a story of resilience, of pragmatism. I wonder where I came up with that concept. And common sense. And I've been enthralled by Alison ever since she stood on stage at the Century Club back last year and talked about Alex Ferguson kicking boots at David Beckham. I think from humble beginnings in Scottish hospitality sector, she talked about starting in the hotel business. She then had a bet the farm moment, moving to South Africa, cashing in an insurance policy, eventually launching a hugely successful training and coaching business. I think if anyone has a story about taking one step and then looking back and saying, yes, it all made sense, probably Alison is the one person who could resonate with that story by having lived it. She's helped thousands of people overcome adversity, including her own struggle with dyslexia and life-changing childbirth trauma, which she shared with grace and with generosity. She's been honored by the British Royal Family. For those of you listening outside the UK, this is a very big deal with an MBE, and awarded multiple honorary doctorates. I don't know if that's true, but you certainly should be.
Just
You're
one.
well on your way.
One so
You're well on
far.
your way.
Maybe I should put
There
another
should
one
be
on the
several
board.
others. Well, we hereby anoint you a honorary Dr. Schuster and Oxley doctor.
Take that.
You can put that on the resume. It'll go miles and miles for you. She's known for practical, no-nonsense tools that help people smash their goals. And so with that, welcome, Alison, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
Now, what we tend to do is put our guests on a spot and say, okay, now it's over to you to tell a story. So this is very Jack and Ori. This is very story time. Where would you like to start? What would you like to tell us about?
Well, I think it's in keeping with the steps theme that you've talked about, because we talked about taking one step. So the story I would like to tell is of Brendan's shoes. So years ago, my background, as you mentioned, David, was in hospitality, and I was blessed to work for Radisson in Manly Beach in Sydney. It was just such an amazing property. Honestly, you didn't really want to go to work. You just wanted to spend the time on the beach. It was such a great destination. And I was thrown into leadership. And I think that, this is in keeping with leadership and careers and business, really, the things that I love. So I was thrust into leadership without any training. Now, I'm sure that you know that would never happen in any organisation. You never promote people without giving them the skills for the job. But because I was good at what I did, therefore, surely that automatically makes you a great leader, doesn't it, David? Not. So I was brought into a role and I was promoted from within. Now, again, I think we all understand these challenges, but with being promoted from within, it was my job to look after the trainees that were on the graduate or not the graduate, but the hospitality programs. And one of the people that I was leading was Brendan, and Brendan was great talent. He was great. He was great with people. He was a great listener. He had the core talent that you need to work in hospitality and be a leader in hospitality. But he didn't quite get the fact that there is a hospitality element around what you wear, when you wear it, how you look. And again, he would come to work as a young person, and I'm sure nobody that's either in this room or has listening to this has ever come and maybe had too much to drink the night before. He hadn't polished his shoes, he hadn't ironed his shirt, and that's a challenge. So again, I think every role has got a challenge as a leader, and we know it now is that it's basically tacit approval. If you don't actually address that with someone, you're not doing them any favours. But as a young leader, I think you try and avoid difficult conversations. I was too scared. I didn't know how to address it. I didn't know how to start the conversation. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't really know what to do. So I then came back to having this conversation and I thought, right, I'm going to have to sit him down. Now, I think I now come from the world of sales originally. And I think people say to me, what's one of the, the meaning of life? If you've got a skill that you could teach somebody, is asking great open questions. Because as you lead someone, it's like trying to convince them to do something you want them to do the way you want them to do it. But we all know bad leadership is do this, do that, do the next thing. So having great questions on how do you think, you coming in late affects your performance? How do you think it affects the guests? How do you think not having polished your shoes or ironed your shirt, how do you think that affects your potential for being able to become a leader yourself. So Brendan then really, the penny dropped. And I think it comes back to this feedback, isn't it? We all know that feedback is the breakfast of champions, but you've got to be gracious to accept that breakfast of champions rather than taking it as a criticism. You take it in the way that, for me, I'm delivering it as a gift. You can either accept it as a gift or you can accept it as a criticism. Anyway, Brendan and I are now still friends on Facebook. So this is over 30 years ago. And Brendan is now one of the biggest area managers in Australasia. I think he manages over 200 hotels. And we still have the conversation about how important the story of Brendan's shoes and, bringing it back down to pragmatism. It was a difficult thing to do, but it was an obvious thing. It was common sense. But as a young leader, having those conversations, and I think, there's twofold there, isn't there? There's a leadership conversation and there's a career conversation. And to me, it's when the two conversations collided that we managed to find some pragmatic things that Brendan could do to affect his career.
And why does the story stand out for you? So is there something about how it unfolded that made it sort of stick in your mind as a pivotal moment for you?
I think so now as a speaker at events, I've got to find relatable stories to the audience. And when I was sort of searching my memory banks, looking at my leadership journey, because I do a lot with the SLTs or I do a lot with the leadership teams, I had to reflect back on what was one of the biggest challenges I had in that space. And it was definitely that. So the fact that it sticks out so much is part of my content now, David. It's in the new book. So it's really fresh in my memory.
And when is the new book out?
When I get it finished.
Okay.
I think we're about halfway through. So it's got busy now speaking at events, and I need a little bit of a break where there's no events. Obviously, from a cash flow perspective, I don't want the events to stop, but I know that we need to get it done. I'd say maybe 20,000 words in. Not bad, but still got a bit more to go.
There are so many aspects of the story that I love. One of them is just this human component. We have two lives, the lives that we live outside the corporate world where we're allowed to say what we really mean. And then we have the corporate life where there's certain protocols. So we've all had those situations wherein, someone's turned up at the headquarters, not in their best suit, not with their polished shoes. And the question becomes, why does that matter if the substance of what they have to say is really important? I think hospitality is different. So what do you think when you came across that as a leadership challenge, did you intuitively say, this is important, it does matter? Or did you have some reservations about, am I doing this because I've been told to do it?
No, I think, again, you're right, because and it's not the aesthetic looks of the person, it's the finish of what they are wearing. It's really important because in hospitality, you are the brand. And that's where it's to do with the branding of the hotel, because if someone looks like that, it casts aspersions on the whole hotel. If they've not ironed, does that mean my rooms are going to be dirty? Or, we go off on tangents based on again, not the aesthetics of that person, but how they are finished off, really. And I think there's been a great thing. Obviously, business dress has changed. It's like, even now, like I'm working with a lot of the Fortune 500, the FTSE 100, and I can turn up now in my Air Force Ones, and I've got a new pair of Air Force Ones, so they've got to be quite white, they've got to be quite shiny, but they're comfortable. And even now, going back, like it used to be, you had to wear a tie to work, you had to wear this to work. I think that the dress codes have changed, but to me, I think it's better because if you're more comfortable in yourself and in your attire, you can be more relaxed. And I don't mean more relaxed as in you drop the standards, but to me as a creative, the more relaxed I am, the more creative I am, the better ideas I come up with, the better I can help organizations. So to me, that's linked, and it's not about, I wouldn't dream of turning up in dirty clothes or dirty, but it's the comfort levels, I think, help creativity, which help business.
And I think that's key, because I think what you just said makes the whole difference, that there are occasions where I think you feel like you're saluting the flag and giving an instruction. And then there are other occasions where you go, I absolutely understand why this is important. I think they're easier to do the latter when it's sort of like management systems 101. When you get promoted, you're suddenly given all these tasks. You're going to have to do an annual appraisal for someone. You're going to have to give someone some feedback. You're going to have to tell them, if there's a ranking system, you're going to have to tell them how they were rated. Some of the stuff is important. It's very important, but it's difficult to feel whether or not you have any influence over them. And then there are other occasions where you go, no, intuitively, this makes absolute sense to the performance of the team, and we need to be the best team we can be. I think is it easier to be a leader in the latter instance than the former, or how do you reconcile the two?
I think the thing with a leader is you are the role model. So this is the thing. Are you saluting the flag because you've been told to do this, or are you living and breathing what you actually believe in as a leader? And that's where, I've worked with people and they've been hypocritical leaders, do this, do that, do the next thing, but they're not doing it themselves. And I think it's been really interesting as a leader, obviously in my own organisation. Not everything goes according to plan. And I think that's just business for you. But I think if you look in larger organisations, it's much easier to put a blame culture in place. Oh, that's not my fault, that's somebody else's fault. But ultimately, as the leader, when things don't go according to plan, I've got to review it, I've got to analyse it. But 99.9% of the time, the buck stops with me, because if it didn't go according to plan, I probably didn't communicate it very well, or I didn't train you to do it very well. And it comes back to me. If I have done that and you haven't, then is it attitude or is it aptitude? And that's a completely different conversation. But 9 times out of 10, like literally the buck stops with me, and that's where I'll say to the team, yep, this happened, but I didn't communicate with you properly what I wanted, so you're not psychic. How do you know that? And we work through it together. And I think that's where great leaders are honest. And I think it's an overused word, but like showing vulnerability, it feels so Brene Brown to me. It's being yourself and being honest and saying that, yeah, this is, maybe we could have done this, or actually that happened and I didn't train you to do this. Let's look at a training program so that we can, we can both learn, because every day is a school day. I don't know everything about leadership. I know I talk about it, but nobody knows everything about everything. So I think being honest that you don't know everything about everything makes you a great leader, because you're being honest about what, the direction and where you're going.
What are your thoughts, Helmut?
Yeah, that really resonated. A question I really have is, you work a lot with very young leaders, you coach them, you mentor them, and there's so much bad reputation talk about the next generation. My impression is that actually the next generation leaders are far more authentic than, let's say, our generation. Do you have opinion on that?
Yeah, it makes me so angry when people disrespect younger generations. I genuinely can't stand it. And you hear a lot of, they're lazy, they're on their phones all the time, they're this or they're that. No, I genuinely don't believe that. And I work with a lot of young people in the entrepreneur space, and my team are all young. And I think we just do things differently. We think differently. And I think to me, it comes back to the collaboration. Like there's things that with age comes wisdom. There'll be situations that, I understand a bit more about this. But with tech and AI and new things coming together, new forums, new things happening, to me, the strength in organizations and the strength in leadership is listening to every different angle. I talk about the behavioral. Obviously, I do the DISC methodology and understanding why people behave differently, how they behave differently. But I think one of the things that I'm talking about more and more now is understanding of generations and how they think and what they want from roles and how they've just been brought up. We look at the comfort zones. This is one of the things I see that a lot of people, I did it yesterday, literally with a government body around generational, because when we look at the things that they find scary, the things around change, people of my age, it's all about tech. Oh, I'm really scared. I'm a tech, and they call themselves technophobes. I hate when people do that. If you label yourself a technophobe, then how are you ever going to learn? You've already switched your mind off to not learning new things. And then we look at the younger generation who are, very great at tech, but they've never had to pick up a phone. And they've never had to really have conversations face to face, because during their short lives, we've had years that they weren't even allowed to leave their houses. Again, we've all got things we're scared of. And that's where I think intergenerationally, being able to acknowledge those and work together to help each other. Can you give a young person confidence to pick up a phone? Yeah, you can. You can really coach them through it. Can you help older people to stop saying they're technophobic? Yeah, you can. And to me, it dumbfounds me why young people get such a bad reputation. It makes me really annoyed.
Can I ask a follow-on question? You wrote a post today which was to do with 70-hour weeks.
Yes.
And I found that actually very interesting, because you stated it's absolutely legal, but you also stated, me in my company, I have a 4-day work week. Yeah. And lots of the bad reputation of the next generation is that leaders sometimes say they're lazy, they don't work hard, and all that. What is your take on that in terms of time and work, input versus output?
So I think it's really interesting with the 72-hour work week. I'll put a wee bit more context into that. So I do a lot of contribution on radio. So I was contacted by the BBC yesterday to give my opinion on this 72-hour week. And it is a tech startup business in the US, in New York. And you and I both know, Helmut, when it comes to the tech space, as an investor, it's a race. So they put out the job description and said it's from 9 till 9 a.m., 6 p.m., 6 days a week in the office. This is the role. We are in the tech startup space. We are, and again, they're going for exit. They're racing, and you can't do those amount of hours. To me, for your health, for your mental health, in a long marathon, that can't be how you live the rest of your life. But if you're going for the sprint to get the exit, to cash out, some of these young entrepreneurs could be retired at 30 and never have to work another day in their life. So to me, if there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, people will literally go towards that pot of gold, no matter how old they are. They think they can exit. And as an investor, you want that exit out there. Let's get out there, let's get our money back. But on a normal, and this is where I think the comparison sits with the corporate industry or the corporate world. It used to be back in the day, people wanted you to work like work. But it's about working smarter, not harder. Work-life balance is important, and life is not a sprint. Life is a marathon. It is about having a work-life balance. And if somebody's happy at their work, they're really happy to come to work. We know that they're going to perform better. And if you can get things done in 4 days, then why would you have to cram it into 5? Because if you're going back out of work and you go home and you're miserable, that's got a knock-on effect to your children, to your partner, to your parents, to everyone. You're just miserable. So to me, the work-life balance is really, really important. So I think that post was, it was taken off the back of a startup in the US. And I think that is an exception rather than a rule.
It's an interesting
Sorry.
subject, and it comes back a little. What are we measuring? Are we measuring the amount of time you're present, or are we measuring the outputs from those times, or what do we hold to be most valuable? I think generationally as well, there's a clash between how we have invested in the next generations to talk about purpose, cause, outcomes, having some sort of impact, and then how that sort of sits oddly with the idea of you will be present between 8 and 6, and you will be available if I call you. It seems to be just there's a paradox. I feel like the two things are somewhat odds with one another. Either you're measuring the inputs or the outputs.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think one of the things, if you, it's lead by example. So we know that 82% of people do not have a personal time management system in place. So 82% of people's time is, I don't know whether I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, it's a shit show. So that they can't manage their time. So the knock-on effect is, again, it's lead by example. If you're in the 82% and you're working loads of hours because you're not organised and you're not getting the outputs and you're just not doing it, the knock-on effect is that to your team. So it starts with good leadership, good habits. And for me, I can remember, again, a mistake that I made because I had been working from home since I was 28 years old. So I'm obviously slightly older than that. But the joy of working in sales, that yes, we had an office, but we were on the road most of the time. The car was our office. We worked from home. We had our fax machine at home. So we did, David.
Yes,
We had our fax
I remember
machine.
those.
We had everything. So I've always been an incredibly productive person and being able to work from home. But when I started my own business, it's a different, when you move into your own stuff, it's a different ball game from being an employee. And I can remember I was doing 70 odd hours, and I can remember it's never been the expectation for me, for my employees to work outside office hours. Never. It's just never been. It is okay for me because I run the business, but my expectation is that they're not at my beck and call whenever I'm working. And I can remember getting a text, this is way back, this is over 14 years ago when I set the business up, from one of my team who was the same age as me, older than me. She used to be my old boss. And I was in the car, I was going somewhere. She sent me a text about a work thing that was happening on Monday. And I picked up the phone to her because I thought it's just easier to pick up the phone. And she nearly, like, I don't know what was going on in her head, but she would be thinking, because we came from corporate, that was never acceptable. You would never have got a phone call from a boss on a Sunday, or you shouldn't ever. And it then really resonated with me. I've overstepped the mark here. This is bad leadership. I'm phoning her, and as an owning the company, you've got to look at the risk. You've got to look at the consequences of doing things like that. So it gave me a big wake up call. So with my team, I'm very no emails on phones, just nothing. When you finish, you put the laptop lid down. I think another thing, coming back to poor time management, we've got an empty inbox policy. So every single day, we don't finish every task, but I talk about Alison Edgar's big balls, as you know, that's one of my things. So we look at the tasks that are involved. Is this a basketball? Does it need to be done today? Is that a tennis ball? Can we do it by the end of the week? Is that a ping pong ball? Can we get this done within, the monthly period? And therefore, every single time, every one of the girls finishes, we put the laptop lid down and there's no emails that need to be answered. So when you pick up your laptop the next day, you're really proactive, you're in control of your time, you've not got the Sunday night fears. So to me, again, it comes back to the leader being organised. But I had to find it out the hard way. I don't sit here on the podcast saying, oh, look at me, I'm perfect. It was the mistakes that I made that helped me to learn, to make me be the person that I am today, which again, a thought leader in that leadership space.
We are at that stage of the podcast, I'm afraid, that I'm going to start to bring us to some conclusions. We start a little bit by wrapping up that section by just reflecting back on the conversation. Let me start with Helmut. Helmut, any reflections on the discussion so far that you feel are worthy of summary, or asking Alison to...
For me, one of the reflection is, and we had that in the introduction, is actually how important it is actually to both have the substance, but also the appearance, the packaging. And I do believe in our current time, it's as important or more than ever. And the other thing I wanted to say about your story around the 72 hours, I remember and go back, and I agree. In the previous times, it was basic corporations who had to torture you. And this is actually not acceptable anymore. And that's a good thing. So I really like that.
And we've had a wide-ranging conversation. We started off with a pair of unpolished shoes and ended up with 72-hour weeks. All the best conversations, I feel like, follow something similar. In a way, I talked a little bit about the chaos of careers and the idea that you deal with the subjects that are in front of you. And I think this podcast is a lovely illustration of that. Started one place and ended up in another. But any reflections you have on our discussion to this point? Anything else that you think you would like to...
For me, I think the pragmatism was really interesting, because I'm thinking, I wonder where this is going to go. And I think one of the things that I think is, if we look at the world of business, a lot of the time we look at the senior leadership team and, we have things that we do that follow the corporate pathway, but it doesn't always drill down into every level of that organization. And that's where I think, for me, simplification is the key to good business, because it might be, if you're sitting in a boardroom and people go, yeah, oh yeah, I understand that. So to me, it's looking around the pragmatism and the simplification. And that was my reflection, thinking, having these conversations, because as you know, as the only doctor in the room that doesn't actually have a degree, there is imposter syndrome. And sometimes I think, I wonder if I'm going to be out with my depth in these conversations. And it's not. I think it comes back to that simplification, understanding and communication. So to me, that's my biggest takeaway. I adore spending time with both of you. I'm just gutted that we didn't get to sing James Sit Down, because I think that's probably one of all of our favourite songs.
It's a classic. For those of you who have not read A Groundhog Career, each of the chapters in the story talks a little bit about a song inspiration for that chapter. One of them early on was the James classic Sit Down, in which he talks about, if you consider yourself I can't remember the exact words, but if you consider yourself somehow...
If you're touched by madness, sit down next
Yes.
to me. So that's why we're all
That's
sitting
right.
in the same room.
If you're touched by madness.
Well said.
And there is, and we talk about imposter syndrome, and we did that a little bit when A Groundhog Career was launched. But the idea that we each see our flaws, and actually, in a way, this is a full circle moment going back to the shoe story. I suspect that the individual was criticizing or beating themselves up more than they could possibly, So there is this internal monologue that we have about ourselves, that we're not worthy, that we're not ready, that we're not as polished, we're not as good. We don't need much nudging to go, yeah, you're right, I do suck. So I think, let me end this a little bit on a more upbeat note, however, and say that every time we get a conversation with Alison, I am bowled over by her enthusiasm, her repertoire of stories. Alison's big ball story is a lovely one to sort of just leave out there and repeat. But Alison is an extraordinary public speaker. If you have a corporate event and you need someone to come and inspire people, to give them a pragmatic, I would argue, common sense view of how to be a good leader, how to achieve extraordinary goals by one practical step in front of the other. And then if we have someone in our lives that can help us bring it down to, well, all you need to do is take this one first step and it will take you on your way. I think Alison might be that person for anyone listening to this podcast. She certainly has impressed us in all the time we've known her. So with that, I am going to close out the podcast. For those of you who have not seen Alison's books, I'll provide a link to them here in the feed at the end of the podcast. If you haven't read A Groundhog Career, then you should put that right, because Alison appears in that and also helped us launch the book. So I'll give you a link to that. Helmut is very keen for me to tell you that if you like this podcast, you will love our books, so I'll share links to all of those. We have some other social media out there and a podcast library now of something like 25. All of them have been very interesting. All of them have gone down different paths and tangents, and we've loved them all. This wraps up my conclusion to the podcast. Thank you, Helmut Schuster. Thank you, Alison Edgar MBE.
Thank you for having me.
And with that, unless there are any final words, I will close us out.